1953, a guy named Henry Molaison went in for a cutting-edge brain surgery at that time, 1953, and it was intended to treat his epilepsy, which he had had since childhood. The surgeon in the procedure, removed a piece of Henry's brain, not knowing that piece of his brain impacted his short-term memory. In an interview about this cutting-edge surgery following the procedure, Molaison was asked, "Do you remember what you did yesterday?" And he said, "No." He said, "Do you remember what you did this morning?" And he said, "No." And they said, "Well, what will you do tomorrow?" And he replied, "Whatever is most beneficial to me." You see, he had no idea what he would do tomorrow because he didn't remember what happened yesterday. His inability to remember the past, everything. Is this my mic? We good? I feel like if I talk, it's going to do something. Is that me? This never happens. Stretch out my cord. All right, switch mics if I need to. So his inability to know what he was going to do tomorrow was impacted by his inability to remember what he had been doing. He had no idea. He was just going to take it as he came because he couldn't remember his past or his present. So whatever was most beneficial to him was his answer. He had no life pattern. He had no rhythm. He didn't remember what he did when he got up in the morning. He didn't remember his morning cup of coffee and how he got dressed and what he went to do and all these things because he could no longer remember. It impacted his present and his future. We talked about in the very first week of this series the idea of spiritual amnesia. This idea of spiritual amnesia is our tendency to forget who God is and what God has done in a way that impacts our present and our future. And spiritual amnesia most often happens when we face the brutal realities of life, especially in our seasons, our moments of difficulty, which is what brings us to Psalm 77. Psalm 77 is written by a guy named Asaph. He was a prominent Levite of the tribe of Levi that was appointed by David during his reign to lead worship in the tabernacle. The sons of Asaph continued this legacy of leading worship for generations to come. Several of the Psalms that are not written by David are written by either Asaph or the sons of Asaph, because most of the Psalms are songs. And we don't know the exact life situation behind this particular psalm, but it displays a deep mental, spiritual, and emotional anguish. It displays this struggle to reconcile our faith with seasons and moments of crisis and despair. The psalmist is overwhelmed by difficulty. He's overwhelmed by confusion. But through reflection, through remembering, he moves from despair to hope, showing us how to maintain faith, how to maintain hope, even when we feel abandoned. So let's walk through this incredible psalm together. We kind of set the stage in verse 1. I cried aloud to God, and he will hear me. In the day of my trouble, I seek the Lord. In the night, my hand is stretched out without wearying. My soul refuses to be comforted. When I remember God, I moan. When I meditate, my spirit faints. This first section, this first part of this psalm is often called lament. A lament is a word, a biblical word that basically means a desperate cry for help. It's pain, it's hurt, it's this desperate cry for help. Now, there are entire psalms that are categorized under this idea of lamenting. The psalmist is in a deep place of angst, and we notice that through his heartfelt language. I cry aloud for help. This is the idea of wailing, of weeping aloud. He uses phrases like his day of trouble, the idea of stretching out his hand, of reaching for God is the idea. One of the ideas behind lifting our hands in worship that's driven by biblical imagery is the idea of reaching out to God for his help, kind of our need for him. I'll often use the illustration that when my kids were small enough that they would run up to me, and their natural instinct as a child when they want mommy or daddy to pick them up is to reach their hands high into the sky, to reach up for comfort or for help or to be lifted up. And that's our natural response as children of God. That's why the scriptures are filled with the idea of lifting hands and reaching out to God, that we are his children in need of his help. And so we see that imagery here of stretching out hands and that he is inconsolable. He is moaning. The phrase here is that his spirit faints. His cry in these first three verses is raw and it's honest and it's desperate. As Marcia mentioned, we can identify with the psalmist here. As humans, there are times that we feel God seems so distant that our prayers go unanswered. There are times that the weight of the brokenness, that the reality of the struggle is overwhelming. And this psalm reminds us that it is okay to be honest with God. It's okay to be honest with God about our hurt and our pain. It's okay to express our pain. It is okay to cry out to God in these seasons. That this psalm reminds us of the brutal reality of life and that we do not have to deny the brutal reality of life. That we do not have to pretend it doesn't exist, that the pain is not real. That this psalm reminds us that we can accept and embrace the brutal reality of life. We do not have to deny the brokenness of the world that we live in or the pains and anguish of our own heart. And so he opens with this cry of lament. And then things turn even, in a more severe direction as his lament turns even to doubt. Verse 4, you hold my eyelids open. That is the idea of he can't sleep, that his pain is so severe, his anguish is so severe that he can't sleep at night. I'm so troubled I cannot speak. He can't put into words the depth of what he's going through. I consider the days of old, the years long ago. I said, let me remember my song in the night. Let me meditate in my heart. Then my spirit made a diligent search. So he goes looking. He's trying to remember. He's trying to recall. But look at these questions he comes up with. Will the Lord spurn forever and never again be favorable? Has his steadfast love forever ceased? Are his promises at an end for all time? Has God forgotten to be gracious? Has he in anger shut up his compassion? He goes from lament to this idea of doubt. He's in a faith crisis here. He has questions. He has doubts about the goodness of God. And the psalmist wrestles with some deep questions here. Will the Lord reject me forever? Will he refuse to show his favor upon me? Has his love disappeared? Is God no longer gracious? Is God angry at me? Perhaps you've been in a season of life where you felt those things. You can identify. Has God forgotten who I am? Is God mad at me? Is his compassion withdrawn from me? Like, these are the type of honest questions that surface during seasons and moments of difficulty. Good news. These are the type struggles that we find all throughout the scriptures, all throughout the biblical story. I mean, whoever you want to put on the most famous Bible character list, Abraham, Moses, David, Job, the disciples, all these people that I just mentioned went through similar faith crises, moments of doubt and struggle and questions. And is God there? And does God care? And is God a God of compassion? Is God angry? You see, doubt is a natural part of the faith journey. During difficult times, we tend to question. We tend to question his compassion, his love, his kindness, his presence in our lives. And again, the Psalm 77 reminds us, and many other Psalms, it's okay to bring these doubts to God. As a matter of fact, it's better to bring these doubts and questions to God than to just bury them or allow them to just kind of conceal themselves in our hearts. So the first half of this psalm paints a very bleak picture. And it's a picture with which we can identify. Lament, pain, hurt, desperation, heartache, suffering, grief. This is the reality of the human experience, living in a broken world. And it is in these moments and seasons that we are invited by Psalm 77 to remember who God is and remember what God has done. Verse 10, then I said, I will appeal. I like this language. I will appeal. I'm going to appeal to this, to the years of the right hand of the Most High. I will remember the deeds of the Lord. Yes, I will remember your wonders of old. I will ponder all your work and meditate on your mighty deeds. You see, there's a turning point in this psalm, and this turning point is triggered, it's initiated by this idea of remembering. I will intentionally remember. I will appeal to what I know about God. So again, this is coming right off of all these questions. Is God there? Does God care? Is God angry? And even when it doesn't make sense to the psalmist, he says, what I'm going to do is I'm going to appeal. I'm going to remember what I know about God. This is a seismic shift in this psalm in verse 10. He intentionally remembers who God is, what God has done. I love the language here. I will appeal to his years of faithfulness. I will remember his deeds. I will remember his wonders. I will ponder. I will think about his work. I will meditate on his mighty deeds. In my pain, in my hurt, in my doubt, in my suffering, in my brokenness, in my distress, in my heartache, in my disappointment, in my consequences for my own choices, my own sin, in my brutal reality, in my struggle, I will remember. I'll remember who God is. I'll remember what God has done. And this change in his perspective begins with a shift in focus. A shift in focus, which is initiated by intentional remembering. You see, remembering how God has worked in our lives renews and fuels our trust in him, even in our most difficult times. It reminds us that he is in control. And then look how this shift takes place, starting in verse 13. Look at the difference in verbiage here from the first part of the psalm. Your way, O God, is holy. What God is great like our God? You are the God who works wonders. You have made known your might among the peoples. You with your arm redeemed your people, the children of Jacob and Joseph. When the waters saw you, O God, when the waters saw you, they were afraid. Indeed, the deep trembled. The clouds poured out water. The skies gave forth thunder. Your arrows flashed on every side. The crash of your thunder was in the whirlwind. Your lightnings lighted up the world. The earth trembled and shook. Your way was through the sea, your path through the great waters. Yet your footprints were unseen. You led your people like a flock by the hand of Moses and Aaron. So there's a perspective shift here, and he moves from lament to doubt and questions and all these things, the turning point to remember, and now he's rejoicing in who God is. A perspective shift that ends in rejoicing. You see, the psalmist takes a journey. He takes a journey reflecting on God's greatness, reflecting on God's creative power, reflecting on God's redemption and deliverance of his people. He is reminded of God's ability to rescue, God's ability to control even creation itself, God's sovereignty over every life situation. You see, in our moments of doubt, in our moments of struggle, we are invited to lift our eyes to the bigger picture of who God is. That his power is unlimited, that his ways are incomprehensible, that his love is immeasurable, that his grace is sufficient. And being reminded of who God is helps us trust him even in our darkest moments. Despair to hope, doubt to trust, distress to faith. Now notice the psalmist does not necessarily find all the answers to his questions. He doesn't even find relief from his situations. But what he finds is peace. And what he finds is confidence by remembering who God is and what God has done. And when we face life's difficulties, we should allow ourselves to feel the weight of our humanness and the brokenness of the world and the pain of despair. But what we cannot do is remain there. Stay there. You see, as followers of Christ, as believers in God, we move toward hope and faith. And we do that by focusing on God's faithfulness, focusing on God's power, remembering God's sovereign control, resting in God's presence, recalling God's past deeds becomes a catalyst of faith and hope in the present. You see, it's okay to struggle. It's okay to doubt. It's okay to question. But we must not remain in that place of despair. We cry out to God. We bring our doubts and questions to Him. And in the process, we remember who He is, what He has done. And we find hope, not in our abilities to navigate it. We find hope in His unchanging character. We've said a couple times in this series now, it's an identity issue. It's an identity issue. That we are His people. That we identify as His followers. That we serve the Creator God. We serve the sovereign God. Our identity is found in Him. And part of our identity as humans living in a broken world with the weight of our own humanity is that we are a needy people, meaning we are people who need to regularly remember who God is, or we will forget because our hearts are prone to be drawn toward the weight, the brokenness, the struggle. And Psalm 77 helps us by reminding us. So, here's the things it reminds us of. I'll just give these to you in kind of imperative statements. Psalm 77 helps us by reminding us to, one, acknowledge your struggles. Acknowledge your struggles. It's okay. It's okay to admit when you're going through difficult times. You see, the psalmist expresses, right? He expresses his distress. He experiences sleepless nights. He even doubts God's faithfulness. All of us have been at that place at some point in life. And it's okay to be there. It's okay to acknowledge that struggle. You see, this teaches us that we don't have to suppress our struggles or pretend that everything is okay. That we can be honest with God and ourselves. And being honest with God and even our own hearts and souls is the first step toward healing. There's been a popular song on the radio recently written by Jelly Roll. I can never get past that guy's name. But it's a confessional song. His last album, he grew up in church. His last album is called Wits at Chapel, which is a little Baptist church that he grew up in. So it has like a lot of kind of spiritual messages and meanings in his song. Not all of them ones that I would agree with, but the idea of him wrestling with these things. But he has a song called I'm Not Okay. And in that song, it says, I'm not okay. I'm barely getting by. I'm losing track of days. I'm losing sleep at night. And again, we resonate with that. We get that. And I'm not sure his answer is the biblical answer. The biblical answer is it's okay to tell God that. It's okay, don't miss this, to tell someone else that you're not okay, to acknowledge your struggles. I know, I get it. We put on the face, don't we? We put on the facade. How's everything going? It's going great. I'm okay. Meanwhile, life is falling apart. Acknowledge our struggles. Identify our brokenness. So we are taught in Psalm 77, it's okay. It's okay to acknowledge your struggles. We're also reminded in this psalm that we are, through Psalm 77, we are to remember His faithfulness. Remember His faithfulness. You see, in our most difficult times, it is essential to remember who God is, to remember what God has done. Because, don't miss this, remembering realigns our spiritual sight. It realigns, it recalibrates our spiritual sight. Because it causes us to shift our focus from us to God. And when we shift our focus from us to God by remembering His faithfulness, it fuels our hope and it strengthens our faith. You You see, we remember his faithfulness. We shift our focus and our perspective, because if we don't, then it becomes all about us, our ability to figure it out, our efforts to try to put the pieces together. But by stopping to intentionally remember his faithfulness, it realizes that even our moments that we have no strength, no ability, no power, that we are resting in the one who does. We remember his faithfulness. And then don't forget, in Psalm 77, we're also instructed to ponder, aren't we? To meditate on his greatness, to ponder his greatness. That when you are struggling, we meditate on the greatness of God. And I like how the psalmist here takes it to creation. That it's easy for us to go out and just open our eyes and look at what's around us. Maybe we all need to be in the habit of taking a little time away from the chaos and the busyness of life to just sit and ponder and meditate on his greatness. I would encourage that to take place where his creation is obvious. We were talking in our meeting before service this morning of so many places that we have all around us to be able to do that. And I was remembering that back in the COVID time, that almost every weekend when everything was locked down, that we as a family decided we were going to get out and go explore some of the nature and trails and hiking opportunities all around us that sometimes we overlook or don't take time to do. And man, we hit like every place in North Alabama that we could find. And in the midst of a time of extreme chaos, it brought a peacefulness to our souls every week to be able to reflect on the greatness and the creative power of God. And what the psalmist does here is he takes us to creation, that God is in control. The sea in Hebrew writing represented chaos, darkness, things out of control. And the psalmist says God's in control even over the chaos. He refers back to the Exodus event, right? Remembering the mighty deeds of God. You see, when I recognize how great God is, the size of my problems seem less overwhelming because of how big and great he is. If you have kids like my older kids, they grew up in the era where it seemed like Disney was releasing its very best movies. I don't know if that's still the case. But back in that time, there was releases like The Lion King, like a classic movie. And it's in Disney's The Lion King that there's this moment in the movie where the seasoned sage Rafiki, remember Rafiki's the monkey that has all the wisdom. And so Rafiki goes looking for the young runaway lion cub Simba, who's retreated way out past the desert in the watering hole with Timon and Pumbaa, right? And they're going to live the kind of carefree life, Hakuna Matata. But he finds this young lion cub there to remind him who he is. And in this kind of pivotal moment in the scene, his father, Mufasa, appears to young Simba in the clouds and encourages his distraught and insecure son to remember who he is. Don't forget, young Simba, who you are. You are the son of Mufasa, the Lion King. You see, we meditate on the greatness of who we are, the greatness of our God, the greatness of who we serve. And by meditating and pondering his greatness and his bigness, it enables and strengthens our faith. It provides hope to our weary souls. What about this one? In our Psalm 77, we are also instructed and encouraged to shift our focus. This goes hand in hand with what we've been talking about. Shift your focus. You see, the psalmist starts by being focused on his problems. That's the beginning of the psalm. That's the lament. That's the lament to doubt portion of the psalm. And then there's this pivot in verse 10 and throughout the rest of the psalm. And by the end of the psalm ends with the psalmist rejoicing over God's mighty works. There's a significant seismic life-altering shift that takes place from lament and doubt and fear and questions to rejoicing over who God is. And this perspective shift happens through intentional remembering, which fosters and generates faith. And so the question that surfaces for us in this is, what am I focused on? What am I focused on? Am I focused on the size of my problems, my difficulties, the brokenness, the weight? Am I focused on that? And by the way, it'll get your attention, won't it? It'll grab you by the shirt collar and shake you and say, hey, look at me. Look at your problems. Look at your difficulties. Look at your struggles. It'll get your attention because we live in that reality. But what am I focused on? Am I focused on the problems that are trying to divert my attention from the bigness of God, or am I focused on the size of my God? I like that story back in 2 Kings chapter 6. Elisha, the prophet of God, the king of Syria, is at war with Israel. And there's a story in 2 Kings 6 where God is revealing to Elisha the plans of the king of Syria who's attacking Israel. And so Elisha keeps showing up at the house, the palace of the king of Israel, and keeps saying like, hey, heads up, here's what's going on with the Syrian king. Well, obviously this generates some frustration with the king of Syria. And he's like, who is this guy? We got to hunt this guy down. He's like giving away our secrets. He's pulling back the curtain. All the top secret confidential files, he must have access to them somehow, right? They're in his garage in his house somewhere. That's too close to home. But the top secret files are there. Like, we got to get what's going on with this guy. And so he sends his army to Dothan, not the city in South Alabama, but a different Dothan, to capture Elisha. Elisha's servant looks out and he sees this army. And he knows they're coming after him, and he is terrified. He's terrified when he sees the enemy gathering outside. But Elisha is unfazed. Elisha is completely confident. He says, you're blind. You're blind. Go back and look again. He looks again. It's nothing. Same. On and on. This little scene plays out. The servant is confused. And then Elisha prays a prayer. God, open his eyes. Help him see who you are. The servant goes back and looks again, and he realizes that bigger than the human army that is camped outside their city, there's a heavenly army. And he sees this heavenly army of horses and chariots of fire that are protecting them. And it's just a beautiful reminder of, where is my focus? Is it on the size of my problems, or is it on the size of my God? Shift our focus. And then I think this psalm also teaches us it reminds us to trust his plan. There's a little verse in here that you'll miss it as you just kind of read through it. But it's a beautiful little verse in verse 19. Your way was through the sea. Your path was through the great waters. And then this little phrase that we will often just overlook or read through. Yet your footprints were unseen. You see, God's way was through the sea. God's path was through the great waters. But his footprints, the path, the ways, his footprints were invisible. You see, verse 19 points out that the way of God through the sea, his path through the great waters, but his footprints are unseen. This reminds us that God is working even when we can't see it or understand what he is doing. That we are to lean in and to trust that he is in control even when his footprints are invisible, when they are unseen. That we can trust his plan because he is good and gracious and can be trusted. And then the last thing that Psalm 77 teaches us is to remember to pray to him. Pray to him. Psalm 77 is a prayer to God. And what a prayer it is. It is a prayer that includes lament, crying out, shaking his fist at God at some level. It's a prayer that includes remembering and rejoicing, Like all three of these things, lament, remember, rejoice, all three of these things are part of what it means to bring our fears and bring our doubts and bring our struggles and bring the weight of where we're at and bring our problems and bring our hurts and bring our sin. All of these things are an example of what it means to bring these things to a heavenly Father who hears and cares. Pray to Him. Bring it to Him. Bring the doubts, bring the struggles, bring the questions, bring the fears. Rejoice, remember, this is part of what it means to be a God follower. By the way, He knows those things about our heart and soul more than we know them ourselves. He understands us more fully than we even are able to unpack in our own hearts and minds. So we pray to Him. We come to Him. Final thought. Jesus models this. He models what it means to have hope amid despair. Remember the scene? Jesus is in the Garden of Gethsemane. Tells his disciples to wait while He goes and pours out His heart in anguish to the Father. And we are given a glimpse into that moment as Jesus cries out, Father, take this cup from me, the cup of suffering, the cup of God's wrath for our sin. Father, if there's a way to remove this cup from me, that was His heart, right? That was His despair and His anguish and His distress. Even the picture that's given is the sweat on His brow, or as if drops of blood. He was praying so intently, and His heart is just ravished from what He's been going through. And in that prayer, in that moment, His cry out is similar to this psalmist here. God, would You hear? Would You remove? And then there's that shift, right? But, Father, not my will, but Yours be done. And that's not the end of it, is it? Because it's just a chapter or two later, according to which gospel you're in, that we find Jesus again. Now He's been removed from the garden. He's prayed, not my will, but Yours been done. He's gone through the trials. He's gone through the suffering, the scourging, and all the things that Jesus went through. He's now suspended on a cross. And we, again, are given a glimpse. We're able to hear the words of Jesus, at least 7 phrases. Obviously, there's probably more that happened that day, but the gospel writers give us 7 phrases of Jesus. And one of those phrases is the anguish and the cry of a son's heart to his father, my God, why have You forsaken me? We hear that, right? We hear the anguish. We hear the despair. We hear the hurt. We hear the brutal reality of Jesus taking on our sin, of facing our sorrow and hurt, of taking our place on the cross. My God, why have You forsaken me? The final words we hear from Jesus on the cross, as recorded by the gospel writers, are not, my God, why have You forsaken me? The final words we hear of Jesus are what's translated into our English as just 3 simple words. It is finished. And those 3 words are so all-encompassing that includes so much that we don't have time to unpack. But in the fulfillment of Psalm 77, and in light of our message, what those 3 words, it is finished, how that translates into our everyday life is that Jesus took upon Himself all of that brokenness, all of that weight, all of those things that we've been talking about, that we wrestle with and struggle with, that in that moment, Jesus is saying to us, what I have done is enough for you. It is enough for everyone who will ever follow me, who ever profess me as King. It is enough. You see, Jesus is the greater Asaph. He is the greater psalmist. I love the shift that takes place in this psalm, but Jesus is the greater Asaph. So, what are you facing today? I invite you with Psalm 77. Remember who He is. He's got you, struggling saint. He's got you, weary soul. His strength is all you need and more. Let's bow our heads for prayer.